Hello and welcome to the Young Texas Uninformed podcast. I'm your host, Taylor DeSoto, and in this episode, we are going to be talking about annotating and how to read, basically. So I think it was either a comment or an email or something that had asked the question about annotation. They said, "Hey, I know you annotate your books. I was just curious as to whether or not you had a methodology." And so I do have a little bit of a methodology that I'd like to share. Hopefully, it'll be helpful for you guys as you study and try to really make the most out of consuming content, whether it be written or electronic or however video. I take notes and do annotations for all sorts of things. So let's kind of talk about the three methods of note taking that I employ. So for videos, it's going to be a little bit different than perhaps an electronic book, which is going to be different than a paperback book or a hard copy book. So let's start with books because I think that that's where the substance of this video really is going to be and probably what most people have difficulty with. So if you're not familiar with what annotating is, it's a way to retain more information from the books that you're reading. So I read pretty quickly, anywhere from 500 to 700 words per minute, depending on what I'm reading and how well I want to retain. Anywhere from it kind of depends if you want to retain 65% to 75% or 85% to 95% of the material. So if you're just trying to get through a little paperback, like a 75-page book, sometimes I'll just cruise through that and I won't really worry too much about retaining every little bit of it. But if I'm reading Turretin, for example, I'm going to slow down to about 400 words per minute and take my time. So as you can see, I have a couple of different ways that a couple of different things that I do when I'm annotating. So the first is going to be highlighting. So I know annotating in particular, it's pertaining to actually writing in the margin, but I kind of view this as a full-bodied method that has to do with using sticky notes, highlighting, as well as taking notes in the margin. I think that encompasses the scope of my annotation method. So the first thing I do when I'm annotating is I first read the section and I highlight important key phrases. So in Turretin's Alenctic, Institutes of Alenctic Theology, it's very organized and it's actually really useful to annotate in a book like this that's so organized because you can interact thought by thought. So before we get into the ways that I use highlighting, sticky notes, and actually writing in the margin, let's talk a little bit about what you might use each of these for. So highlighting, I use highlighting specifically for two reasons. The first is that when I highlight something and I'm trying to recall a section, I have a better time remembering what's on the page if I remember the highlight. Because for whatever reason, the way my brain works, my memory, is that I can see the highlighted page easier than I can the non-highlighted page in my memory bank. So if I'm trying to recall something from page 67 of a book, if I actually highlight a keyword on that page, I'll be able to recall it better. And I'm not sure if there's any science to back that up. That's just the way that my brain works. The second reason I highlight is the way that I reference books. So I know that there's a lot of stuff in here. And when I'm trying to find a particular section or a particular paragraph, I can remember, well, I highlighted that word on the left side, the bottom left side of this page around page 200 to 250. So if I know that there's a highlight on the bottom paragraph on the left hand of the left page, then as I'm skimming through it, I can look for a highlight on that part of the section and be able to more easily find the section. So that's what highlighting is. It helps me remember, and it's also a good way to actually reference your books and find pages that you just want to quote directly or reference to somebody. So the second thing that I do is I use sticky notes or little tabs. So as you can see in this book, I have this particular section I was studying, and so I have different color tabs. So the different color tabs mean different things for me. And I think it's important if you're going to use sticky notes or tabs, you should have a system set up. For example, blue might be a section that you want to refer to in a paper or refer to more quickly, or you could have it as maybe you could organize it by topic. So in this example, the blue tab that I have here is a tab that I wanted to reference back to when I was studying the topic a lot more frequently. So I was writing a paper, and I knew the blue tab page was going to be really helpful as sort of a home base for the topic of the paper. And then I had, you can see there's a lot of pink tabs. Those pink tabs were supporting thoughts for the blue tab. So as I was writing my paper, I didn't stop to actually write down all the quotes and references. I knew that as I was writing, I would want to refer back to it kind of dynamically as to be most efficient. So I knew the topic of my paper was blue, and the pink tabs were going to support the thought in blue quite well, at least support the thought as I was explaining it in my paper, as I was drawing it out in my paper. And then you have things like yellow, and there's all sorts of different ways that I've used these tabs to help myself refer back to the material as I was writing my paper. So these are kind of the first two steps of annotation, in my opinion, is kind of reading the section first, whether it be fast or slow, and sort of having a system in place to reference that material quickly. Now, once I've done that, I'll go back and actually read the section and interact with it. Now, there's probably you could do that the other way around. You could interact with it first and then reference it, or interact with it and reference it at the same time. Sometimes I do that depending on how thick the material is, how dense or tricky the material is. If I'm reading John Owen or Turretin or Gill, for example, then it might be more efficient to actually do all that at once, since I'm going to be reading more slowly. But if I'm reading something really fast a couple of times, like some of the little pamphlets that come out for New Testament textual criticism, I'll read the whole book 3 times in, a couple hours with different objectives in mind. The first time to kind of understand the summarization of the material, highlight key terms, be able to reference. The second time I might be tabbing it up for reference for a paper. And then the third time I'm actually interacting with the material after understanding the full scope of what the author is saying, which can be really helpful, because especially if you're reading older writings and they're writing really dialectically, or they're writing in a Ramist sort of scholastic sort of format, sometimes what they're saying initially might not be their final point, and they're drawing out all sorts of different perspectives. And if you don't read carefully, you might think that the author is saying something that they're not. A lot of people do that with John Owen and other scholastic style writers. So with that in mind, when I go to annotate, there's kind of a couple things I keep in mind. The first is, what am I reading this material for? How well do I understand the material at the outset? So if I don't understand the material at all, I'm not necessarily going to be annotating for any other reason other than to maybe ask questions, or to rephrase what they have said in ways that I can understand. So the purpose of annotation is to get your mind engaged with the material. So sometimes I like to call it having a conversation with them, because you're going to be asking questions that you want answered, and depending on how much room you have in the margins. So for example, Turretin has some decently sized margins there. You can actually get away with writing directly in the margins. Some people like to put little loose leaf pieces of paper in the margin, which some people have thoughts about writing in books. They don't like it. But the first thing you set out to do is either understand, interact, or critique. That's kind of the reason you annotate, to understand, interact, or critique. So if you're unfamiliar with the topic, annotating for understanding is your first objective. You're trying to take the substance of the material and summarize it in your own words in the margin, so that you know that you've understood the material. It would kind of be like taking a little quiz as you're going. If you understand the material decently well, let's have an intermediate understanding of the topic, then maybe you're going to be writing to interact. Maybe for example you're trying to understand the difference between Hodge, Bavinck, and Owen on a particular topic, and you're doing sort of a study on the topic. And when you write in the margin, you're interacting and saying, okay, Bavinck takes it this way, Owen takes it this way, and sort of interact that way. That's more of an interaction annotation to let you know, and it helps your memory, because as you're writing, you're engaging actively with the material, and it helps you remember and retain. Now, the third kind of annotation is what you would do with a topic that you're very familiar with, and perhaps you know that you're going to have some criticisms for this author. So, for example, if I'm reading, let's just say Klein on something having to do with the Old Testament, being familiar with different views of Old Testament theology, you would maybe take a more critical perspective and challenge the ideas in the book as you go. Or maybe you could challenge one idea and say, well, he gets it right here, but here he goes off and this is why. So annotating really serves to engage with the material, whether it be to understand more, to interact with a topic that you understand pretty well, or even to critique an author on the subject that you know disagrees with you. And with the intention of understanding, why does he disagree with me? Where does he get off the boat? How much do we agree with? How much do we disagree with? And when you can understand a topic that thoroughly to where you can critique and understand, oh, this is the mechanics of where we disagree, then you know the topic really well, and annotation can help facilitate that kind of understanding. So with Turretin, a lot of my interaction is actually understanding, whereas if I'm reading the King James Only Controversy, I'm going to be criticizing more in my annotations. And the purpose, I think, of this, it's kind of a threefold method, right? You have highlighting, you have tabbing or sticky noting, and then you have annotation. And the three-part system that I use, I don't know if there's someone, somewhere official that's kind of documented this type of methodology. It's just intuitive to me as I learned to read and as I studied through university. This is a method that has really worked for me. So to kind of summarize, I think that's really what I do when I annotate. I either annotate to understand, I annotate to interact, and I annotate to criticize, depending on what the material is and what perspective I'm taking on it. Am I trying to learn more? Am I trying to compare and contrast? Am I trying to criticize so that I can understand an opposite position better than perhaps I had formerly? And so with that, let's talk a little bit about annotating an online or an electronic journal or a PDF or something. It's basically the same process. You're just using different tools. You're using a highlighting tool. You're perhaps right-clicking and using like a note-taking tool. And really, and then you can bookmark and things like this. So really, it's the principles are going to be the same. Now, the third sort of annotation application would be for a video, whether it be on YouTube or a conference recording or anything of that nature. With that, in order to annotate, I actually will write out a manuscript of what I'm hearing. So I did this a lot with Word Magazine with Pastor Jeff Riddle. I do this with Mark Ward when I critique his stuff too. I fully transcribe the material, and then I critique it as though it's an article. So I basically take the video format and translate it into something that can be annotated. And that's a really good way also to have quotes for your papers. If you're transcribing, then it's easier to reference. And when you're transcribing a video, obviously including timestamps, really helpful, including links and things like that to important parts so you can hear it again if you need to, stopping, rewinding, playing at slower speeds to transcribe more efficiently. These are all ways that you can transcribe videos and audio even. Audio is the same thing. I'll do this with a podcast as well. So in summary, that's my annotation method. I use highlighting. I read multiple times. I use tabs of different colors to help myself stay organized. And I also write in the margins or even on a loose leaf piece of paper and slap it into the book, depending on how big the notes are. For example, in To Cast the First Stone, I actually have note cards taped into the pages so I can flip them and have more real estate to interact, because I was not only for that particular book, I was not only annotating to understand, I was annotating to interact and to criticize. So I needed more real estate in the book. So with that, I hope this has been helpful. I hope that, maybe if you guys have any annotation methods that you want to share, write them down in the comments. If you have any more questions about the way I annotate my books, feel free. Oh, I guess one more thing. What utensils do I use? For my pencil, I use a Rotring mechanical pencil. And then I use some sort of archival highlighter. I think Zebra, maybe not Zebra. There's a specific. I don't have one on my desk. I usually do, but I just ran out of it and threw it away. So let me see actually if I can find one for you guys. Nope. Well, maybe I'll leave it in the comments if I can find the highlighter brand that I use. Anyway. Thanks for watching. This has been your host, Taylor DeSoto, with the Young Texas and Reformed podcast on the topic of annotating your books. So may the Lord bless you and keep you, and we will see you all in the next episode.